All right. Hello, BookTube. How's it going? So I am here with Ami from Ami1649, and we are currently in the midst of reading Samuel Beckett's trilogy together, often referred to as the Beckett trilogy or just the trilogy. We have thus far read Molloy, the first in the trilogy, and so we are here for this video, we think, to talk about part one. So anyway, thank you for joining me, Ami. So, for both of us, this is our second time reading the trilogy as a whole. And I guess just to get the ball rolling in this discussion on it, I want to just ask how we both found it just in general, how we both liked it, just initial impressions, but also kind of how our experience may have been different on this second reading from both of our first readings. So, Ami, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I loved it on my first reading. I don't know exactly when I first read it, to be honest, but maybe 5 years ago. Actually, yeah, 4 years, something like that, whatever it was. I loved it. I considered it one of my favorite books, and I think I enjoyed it more the second time. It's so I'm crazy about it.
Yeah. Cool.
It's like one of my favorite books for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked it too on my first reading. I definitely remember it as the most accessible of the trilogy. We'll get to the other two in due time when we get to reading them, but the other two are really challenging from what I remember and by reputation. Molloy is the most accessible. It's the most plot-driven, and it's not even that plot-driven, but it is more plot-driven than the other two. And so I probably got more out of it the first time than the other two. And I really enjoyed it as well. This time around, I feel like one thing that really leapt out at me was the amount of kind of references he was making that I got that I didn't get the first time. And that both refers to the references he occasionally makes to his own other works. He mentions characters from his other novels, right? Like Watt, he has a novel called Watt, and Murphy, and so on. But I think probably more deeply than that, references to things like Dante's Inferno, which I think there's a lot of references to that in this. I think there's...
You'll have to teach me, because I don't know Dante's Inferno.
Okay, well, I can maybe point out some of that as we go through. References to things like Dante's Inferno, possibly also the Purgatorio. Biblical, maybe not biblical references, but certainly religious references.
Yeah.
And references to the Odyssey, I think, which I did sort of get more on my first reading, because I was sort of familiar with the Odyssey on my first reading. But I think just a lot of the reading that I have done since my first reading really brought out a lot more from this. I think also this time around, I appreciated the humor more.
Oh my god, I laughed nonstop.
Yeah,
it's hilarious.
It's funny. I actually read a passage out loud to my mom from this book. I actually, funny enough, was reading this, doing my rereading of this while I was on a short 2-night camping trip. Which it's not the kind of book you would think of as a good camping book, but I was reading it. I was having a blast reading it while camping, and I just read a passage to my mom, and she thought it was funny, you know, and she,
Which passage?
The one when I find it, it's from late in part one of Malloy, so this is it, and having heard, or more probably read somewhere, in the days when I thought I would be well advised to educate myself, or amuse myself, or stupefy myself, or kill time, that when a man in a forest thinks he is going forward in a straight line, in reality he is going in a circle.
Yep.
I did my best to go in a circle, hoping in this way to go in a straight line.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, a lot. The humor really leapt out more on this time, and I was curious if you wanted to read a passage you found particularly funny.
There's also a lot of just like body humor, like potty humor, like sexual humor. Yeah. It's like there's like a vulgar element to it. So I'll read and sort of skip through it. But this kind of descriptions. There's like a vulgarity, and there's just it takes this character Jacques Moran, who's narrating this, takes himself so seriously, and he's describing his sorry state of his clothing. So he says, then there are clothes that cleave so close to the body and are, so to speak, inseparable from it in time of peace. Yes, I've always been very sensitive to clothing, though not in the least a dandy. I had not to complain of mine, tough and of good cut. I was of course inadequately covered, but whose fault was that? And I had to part with my straw, not made to resist the rigors of winter, and with my stockings, which the cold and damp, the trudging and the lack of laundering facilities had literally annihilated. And I let out my braces to their fullest extent, and my knickerbockers, very baggy as the fashion is, came down to my calves. We'll skip a bit here. He says, my boots became rigid, so skin defends itself when dead and tanned. The air coursed through them freely, preserving perhaps my feet from freezing, and I had likewise sadly to part with my drawers, 2 pairs. They had rotted from constant contact with my incontinencies. Then the seat of my breeches, before it too decomposed, sawed my crack from Dan to Beersheba. I thought that was hilarious. Dan to Beersheba. Of course, like drawing that biblical expression.
Yeah. And I think the passage, maybe getting ahead of ourselves just a tad, but I think the passage also speaks to, I think both these characters have like mild OCD, which we'll get to. But so we've both talked about our initial impressions on rereading it, and something we found funny, which is great because Beckett, as I told you a few minutes ago, has this reputation for being this very stuffy intellectual writer who makes all these very highfalutin references, and he does, right, and he was, right, he was very learned, very well read. He was probably very intimidating to speak with because he just seems like he was one of the smartest people who ever lived. But then he also has like potty humor, right?
Yeah.
And he is fundamentally a comic writer.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also like I remember I referenced the other day talking to a friend of mine a passage where he, and I can't, unfortunately, I don't think I can find the passage, but where he refers to just like sticking his finger up his asshole.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, you gotta love a writer where they can make these sophisticated references to the Holy Trinity and to Dante and to whatever, but then also write about, someone fussing with their clothes and stuff,
Yeah, I mean, that's so fundamental, I think, to this book. It's so, first of all, the language is gorgeous and beautiful, and it has like such poetic, strong language, but it's interested in the mundane, in the human, and I think, I imagine Beckett doesn't even, isn't concerned about that distinction between, high and lowbrow, or the tough literary references and the scatological, comedy, because to him it's just like, it's just like it's all there and it's all like accepted, in a way.
Yeah, it's all human. So anyway, now that we're almost 15 minutes into the video, I do just want to briefly introduce what the Molloy is about, to the degree that it's about much of anything. So part 1 of Molloy is about the title character, a guy named Malloy. As far as I recall, I don't think we ever learned his first name. I believe Malloy is his last name. And he apparently has trouble with his legs. So one of his legs, I think, is really stiff, and the other one also doesn't work very well, and I think the other one that it does work is starting to not work.
Yep.
And so his best way of getting around is on a bike. And the sort of driving force of the narrative, again, to the degree that there is much of a conventional narrative here, is that he decides to go look for his mother. He decides to go find his mother. And it's never quite clear why they're separated, or necessarily even why he's looking for her, but that's what Molloy is doing in this part 1 of the novel that's named after him. And basically what we see is him trying to find her and just basically not succeeding, just running into misadventure after misadventure, right? Yeah. He gets picked up by the police because apparently he's posing lewdly on his bike. It's never quite clear to me how he was posing lewdly, but apparently the police thought it was inappropriate and arrests him. He gets sort of kidnapped by this woman named Luce, who gave me very much like Calypso or Circe vibes from the Odyssey. Nice. He eventually leaves her and then just kind of wanders through the countryside. Eventually he seems to not be able to walk anymore. and is basically just left crawling on the earth. And that's kind of the what happens in this, to the degree that anything happens. So you had a question, not to appropriate what you said, but I think it's a good thing to bring up, given that I just tried to describe this. Is you brought up a question to ask about this novel for both of us, is if a stranger, or maybe not a stranger, but if a friend or someone just came and asked you, like, what are you reading? What's it about? How would you try to describe it?
Yeah, well, that experience has happened to me over the past, week or whatever, 2 weeks, and it's tough. I haven't really ventured, because it is such a strange book. But I mean, it's not so interested in plot, right? It's not. It's there's like most narratives we expect are sort of like this sort of outside view of the world, where it's like maybe like metaphorically a camera that sort of can see stuff and sees what's happening. And this is just like so interested in interiority. Like it's Molloy's monologue. The book starts, the framing is like he's in this room. He doesn't really know where he is, but he assumes he's in his mother's room. He assumes like he arrived at home. But that's open to interpretation, of course, no one knows. And so like, it's just him pouring out the content of his thought. And it's such a strange place to be. It's like the opposite of what you expect in a book, but it's like a distillation of what a book can be, down to it's like bare bones of just language, of just thought. And what's happening is just sort of lost in the motion and the energy of his mind.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. And again, it's getting ahead of ourselves, but I think that comes out even more with a vengeance in the next two entries in the trilogy.
Right.
And certainly in Beckett's other fiction, later fiction. His earlier fiction is slightly more conventional with more actual plots. So yeah, and so in terms of, for me, when I'm asked to describe what happens in this book, I haven't actually had the experience while reading it, at least this time, and I don't remember last time because that was almost a decade ago. But I would describe what happens. I would say something like what I just tried to say, although I would also describe part 2 a little bit, which we'll get to. But I would describe it and then probably stand there or sit there awkwardly for a second and then watch the other person giggle and be like, okay, well, that sounds very strange.
Right, exactly.
And I'm like, yes, I know it is very strange.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to go deeper with whoever I'm talking to, and I'll say I'd sort of think about the degree to which the person I'm talking to is someone who wants to hear more about it. If they are, then, and I wanted to go deeper in what I'm saying, I would tell them, this book kind of, for me at a certain point in it, I felt like it was trying to mimic how people in reality describe their own life. Because it's so like when we read a memoir, mm-hmm. or an autobiography, that the person has edited it, has mm-hmm. curated it, maybe has, well, hopefully they haven't made anything up, but they probably have sort of crafted things to be effective. I get the sense that part 1 of this especially is Malloy kind of talking about his own life in the way that you or me would talk about our own lives if someone just sat down and were like, tell me what's going on in your life, Yeah. Because most of us don't have a coherent beginning, right. middle, and end of our lives. We're just like, oh, we have this disconnected these disconnected and semi-connected, but only semi-connected anecdotes about our lives. We'll go off on tangents. We'll include random details that don't seem important. I think there's even a point, I don't know if I'll be able to find the quote in my notes, but there's even a point where he kind of apologizes to the reader about oh, sorry for including all this detail. I'll get back to the narrative in a second. Right. I got the sense that in part 1 at least, he's trying to mimic how real people talk about what goes on in their own lives. Yeah. Which again don't conform to the beginning, middle, and end narrative of most fiction.
Right.
So if I were to go deeper about it, that's what I would say.
I think that it contains its act of creation in it. There's no because it's just stream of consciousness in that way. The characters will say, I'm going to do something, and then they're like, oh, actually, I'm not going to do that thing, or I'll say something, and then I'll say, that was actually, I shouldn't have done that, or that was a lie, or there's a constant process of undermining, where we're not like nothing is solid, in the way you'd expect from like a book, where it's like a finished product, because it's, again, I feel like we're in this sort of unstable terrain of thought where nothing is solid, where the mind is so, the mind does crazy things. It goes to crazy places. There's one part I remember in the book in part 2 where, what's the association he makes? Oh yeah, he maybe he sees a bruise on his knee or something, and that was a trigger. And then he remembers earlier in the story when he was like hitting his son, and he's like so unpredictable are the associations of the mind. You know what I'm saying? And it's just that. So the style to me is so unique and something very like magical about it.
Yeah. It's sort of like the idea of the unreliable narrator taken to like the absolute extreme. Right. To the point where I think late in the novel, again getting a little ahead of ourselves in part 2, you start to question like whether anything that we've just been told happened at all. It's a difficult book to describe. But that's a lot of Beckett's work. So we're gonna, I think, now progress into sharing some quotes that we like. And my favorite quote is from like page 10 of the book. Actually, I will just say, this is somewhat more personal note, the copy of the trilogy that I'm reading is my grandfather's copy. Nice. My grandfather was my maternal grandfather was a professor. He was a scholar of 20th century English and Irish drama in particular, and so Beckett was one of his big focuses, and so Beckett's fiction would not have been his speciality, but he definitely based on his annotations in this book, he seems to have taught it at some point. And I love that he writes at some point right above the page where I have this quote copied down. He writes delicious prose, which I love.
Yeah. I know. It is. That's correct. Yeah.
So the quote that I have is a little lengthy, and both viewers and Ami, forgive me if I sort of stumble over things and don't read it in the most eloquent way, but this is the quote. From there he must have seen it all, the plain, the sea, and then these self-same hills that some call mountains, indigo in places in the evening light, their serried ranges crowding to the skyline, cloven with hidden valleys that the eye divines from sudden shifts of color, and then from other signs for which there are no words, nor even thoughts. But all are not divined, even from that height, and often where only one escarpment is discerned and one crest, in reality, there are two escarpments, two crests, riven by a valley. But now he knows these hills, that is to say, he knows them better, and if ever again he sees them from afar, it will be, I think, with other eyes. And not only that, but the within, all that inner space one never sees, the brain and heart and other caverns where thought and feeling dance their Sabbath, all that too, quite differently disposed. He looks old, and it is a sorry sight to see him solitary after so many years, so many days and nights unthinkingly given to that rumor rising at birth, and even earlier. What shall I do? What shall I do?
So beautiful.
Yeah.
So let me reflect on that for a second. Like, I think a theme that cuts through both books in different ways is this theme of interpretation. And I think in part 2 it's like more prominent because our character, Jacques Moran, sees himself as like an investigator of some sort. But even in this, especially in part 1, like in a different way, but there's this question of like reading your surroundings, reading the world, and then seeing characters and reading what the characters are seeing, and the characters thing, and this level of just like interpretation and the unreliability of interpretation. Like you see something, but you don't know that what you're seeing is accurate. You hear something, you don't know it, and there's this constant, I think, playing with that experience, and that's what I think that the language is beautiful. It's stunning, and it's ultimately like a language of, I think, Molloy reading his context and imagining what one of the characters that he's seeing in the landscape is sort of going to be doing and stuff like that. And it's these layers of interpretation that are so, like I said, unstable, that I think is sort of, to me, like the core theme that I see.
Yeah, and I also saw in that passage, relatedly, it made me think of the famous quote from Heraclitus, where I think he said, "You never step in the same river twice." So I think there's relatedly the idea that the reason that interpretation is so difficult is because we are constantly changing, and what's out there is constantly changing.
Right.
And Beckett, I think, is always trying to capture that in his writing, and that's what makes it so challenging, because that's really difficult to write about.
Yeah.
Anyway, so do you have a passage? Or?
I haven't picked one yet, but
Okay.
there's like, I feel like you can't go wrong. You know, like I feel like anything here. Yeah, here's one. You know, like this is again, this is a beautiful passage that I love. It's his this when he's this is describing his life with Louse or Luce. I'm not sure.
I think it's pronounced loose.
Luce.
I think
That makes more sense. Yeah. And he's just sort of living. He's like sort of stuck there, like you said, like as in like a reference to the Odyssey almost. And he apparently is like in this particular moment like lying on the ground. So basically, Luce is I think this is when Luce is asking him to stay, if I remember correctly. So Luce is talking at him, and I think he's asking where is he, what town are they in, and she's not answering him. And he describes that, you know, she's still talking till nothing was left but this monotonous voice in the deepening night, and the smell of the damp earth, and of a strongly scented flower, which at the time I could not identify, but which later I identified as spike lavender. There were beds of it everywhere in this garden, for Luce loved spike. She must have told me herself, otherwise I would not have known. She loved it above all other herbs and flowers because of its smell, and then also because of its spikes, and its color. And if I had not lost my sense of smell, the smell of lavender would always make me think of Luce, in accordance with the well-known mechanism of association. And she gathered this lavender when it bloomed, I presume, left it to dry, and then made it up into lavender bags that she put in her cupboards to perfume her handkerchiefs, her underclothes, and house linen. But nonetheless, from time to time, I heard the chiming of the hours from the clocks and the belfries chiming out longer and longer, then suddenly, briefly, then longer and longer again. There's the project, like it's so complex because it's so insubstantial. Like every sentence is like has like this characteristic of the language again is beautiful, but there's like this undermining. You know, like we learn out in the middle that he lost his sense of smell. You know, like that part to me is the crux of it. Like if I had not lost my sense of smell, the smell of lavender would always make me think of Luce. Like these hypotheticals, this unfurling of layers of indirection, of layers of like lack of understanding that we are constantly being overlaid on top of the narrative, in a way which sort of undermines like what was said before. You know, and to me that's sort of like being the point. So that was one example.
When the first time I read that passage, I missed the part where it says the well-known mechanism of association.
It's hilarious. I thought it was so funny.
Yeah, that's just funny to me. You know, I have a PhD in psychology, so the well-known mechanism association. I'm like, yeah, well known. You know, this he would have been writing this in the late 40s, early 50s, or published in 51, I believe. And psychology at that time was very much dominated by B.F. Skinner, right? Who's kind of known as a behaviorist, which is all about associations, how we associate a stimulus with a response, right? So it's just interesting to have that sort of psychological language in there, because I also think, again, getting ahead of ourselves slightly, in part 2, I think there's a distinct Freudian element that comes in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, anyway.
Also, you could say searching for my mother.
Yeah, well yeah.
But I want to just also emphasize that this is like, there's like a beautiful passage in a character who is not in communication with the outside world in like a coherent way. Like he doesn't converse really with anyone. You know, like to sort of counterbalance that passage, like it's in the context of a character who is rounded up by the police and is asked his name and he can't remember his name. Right? And then like at some point he's like, my name is Molloy, but like the time had passed is like long since after they'd asked him what his name was, so like they're sort of like flabbergasted, like what is he talking about, you know?
Yeah.
But so it's a character who is so inwardly focused that there's like no real understanding of the world.
Yeah.
So that's why this well-known mechanism of association is like so hilarious. Like, it's like such a strange character we're dealing with.
Yeah. I also think there are some good, not exactly one-liners, but some passages that are much shorter that are
Yeah.
just really striking.
Yeah.
So one that really leapt out to me, again, early-ish in the book, he says, "I speak in the present tense. It is so easy to speak in the present tense when speaking of the past. It is the mythological present. Don't mind it."
I love that.
And I found that, and there's a passage from part 2 again that I kind of related to that. They both kind of have that idea of, I'm speaking of the past, but in the present tense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's one other. Oh yeah, he says, "Against the charitable gesture, there is no defense that I know of. You sink your head, you put out your hands, all trembling and twined together, and you say, 'Thank you, lady. Thank you, kind lady. To him who has nothing, it is forbidden not to relish filth.'"
Right.
Which I love that last sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a line which I don't have open right. Maybe you remember it also, but like towards the end where he says that he's like in a ditch. The part one ends with him basically crawling on the ground, ending up in a ditch, and then he hears like, I'll help you. Like someone says, "I'm coming to help you. Don't worry, I'll help you." And he has this line like, part of like trying everything in life is to like also try like being helped. You know what I'm saying? So it sort of reminded me of that.
Yeah. I don't think I have that copied down, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't have to.
That makes sense.
And if I can just say one more thought, like also in this category of describing our character, like there is I think of a Waiting for Godot element, like a homeless vagabond kind of character that we're dealing with here, that deals with like, some of the same questions that come up in Waiting for Godot. Like the question of suicide comes up a lot, in a haphazard, like a comical kind of way, like he's talking about like why he hasn't committed suicide, like he tried to commit suicide and it didn't work, for one reason or another.
Yeah. Or he tries to commit suicide and he can't do it because of the physical pain.
Right.
Which I actually thought was like morbidly comic. It's like he wants to kill himself, but it's too painful to kill myself, so I guess I'll go on living.
Right. There's the whole section on that, which is actually the whole section is worth reading. But there's like a quote here, which again, just to give us a sense that's very short of this guy, like, there have always been two fools among others, like the undermining among others, like nothing's ever stable. There's always been two fools among others. One asking nothing better than to stay where he is, and the other imagining that life might be slightly less horrible a little further on, so that I was never disappointed, so to speak, whatever I did in this domain. We can stop there, but yeah.
I love that passage. Actually, I read that and I was like, so it was Samuel Beckett who invented there are two wolves inside of you meme. There's that meme that always goes around. Yeah. People say there's two wolves inside of you, and then everyone has their different take on it. All right, so I think we've talked out part 1 for now. So we're gonna do a separate video on part 2. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, that wraps up part 1. Hope everyone enjoyed. If you have read Molloy in its entirety or just part 1, please leave your thoughts or questions in the comments. And we will, whichever one of us whose ever channel this is posted on, we will get back to you. So, bye guys.